Welcome to the lecture entitled Chatting, Flirting, Seduction, Sex, and Infidelity. I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll discuss 7 topics. 1. Why care about electronic sexual chatting? 2. Portmann's guiding question, central thesis, and subsidiary questions and theses. 3. Intrinsic versus extrinsic moral properties. 4. Portmann's central argument. 5. The moral properties of electronic sexual chatting. 6. The relation between electronic sexual chatting and infidelity. And 7. Electronic sexual chatting and power relations. In this lecture, we'll primarily be focusing on John Portmann's 2001 article, Chatting is Not Cheating. Portmann is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. His research focuses on moral psychology, the history of morality, cultural studies, Roman Catholic history and theology, sexual ethics, and psychoanalysis. Before we begin, a terminological point. Portmann prefers the term dirty talk or internet dirty talk, as well as a number of related terms to refer to the phenomenon of 2 or more people mutually saying sexually things to one another via an electronic intermediary, such as a computer or a phone. Unfortunately, that term, dirty talk, contains the term dirty, which presupposes that there is something unclean or contaminated or unworthy or otherwise bad about this sort of communication. While there may be bad things about this sort of communication, we shouldn't presuppose badness via our choice of terminology. Our investigation ought to be as value neutral as possible from the get-go. Accordingly, I will be using the term electronic sexual chatting, sometimes ESC, in this lecture. My hope is that this term, electronic sexual chatting, is both broad enough in scope and sufficiently value neutral to capture the relevant phenomenon in an appropriate way. We might wonder, before we begin our investigation at the outset, who even cares about the sexual and moral properties of electronic sexual chatting? Isn't this at best a subsidiary and an applied issue in the philosophy of sex? Wouldn't it be better for us to answer more fundamental, more foundational questions, and then just apply our answers to those questions to issues like electronic sexual chatting? Well, there are a number of issues that revolve around electronic sexual chatting specifically, and so we might care to address this issue head-on rather than treating it as a subsidiary and applied issue in the philosophy of sex. First, an examination of the sexual properties of electronic sexual chatting can give us insight into a definition of what sex is. If electronic sexual chatting is a type of sex, then we've learned something about the definition of sex by looking at it. If it's not a type of sex, we've further learned something about sex by looking at it. Infidelity is an important issue in many relationships and many cultures. If electronic sexual chatting can count as sex, it may also count as a form of infidelity. Socially, we're very concerned with the sexual behavior of our politicians, our teachers, our religious leaders. This isn't to say that we should be, it's just to say that we are. Thus, whether electronic sexual chatting is a form of sex should concern us in equal measure. Groups whose sexuality has traditionally been strictly monitored and controlled, women chief among them, have a sexual outlet via electronic sexual chatting. Understanding the use and control of electronic sexual chatting helps understand, or reinforce, or even fight against this form of sexual control. And finally, the sexual behavior of children has traditionally been strictly monitored and controlled. If electronic sexual chatting is a form of sex, then children's use of the internet or of texting has sexual possibilities via electronic sexual chatting. If, on the other hand, electronic sexual chatting is not a form of sex, then perhaps parents and other caregivers could be less concerned about children engaging in it. There are many different kinds of electronic sexual chatting, many more than Portmann makes explicit in his article. Here are just some of those kinds of electronic sexual chatting, and sometimes these categories interact with one another, sometimes they're separate from one another, so this isn't an exhaustive list, and I don't claim here that this list is giving you distinct kinds of electronic sexual chatting. There's professional electronic sexual chatting of any sort. For example, someone might call a phone sex line, or someone might chat on a phone via texting with a professional, and in both of these cases, somebody is getting paid. There's anonymous internet chatting, where people meet, don't know who the other person is, and chat sexually via the internet. There's known internet chatting, where people who know one another, either in person or because they've established a relationship on the internet, chat sexually with one another. There's anonymous texting, where people send text messages to other people who they don't know, and these text messages are sexual in content, in nature. There's known chatting, where people who know one another, either in real life or because they have established a relationship on the internet or via texting, text one another sexual things. There's semi-anonymous chatting via apps like Tinder or Grindr. Perhaps people can see profiles of one another and they can somewhat get to know one another via these profiles, but they don't actually establish a relationship and they're not fully anonymous, and they send messages that are sexual in nature. There's anonymous voice chatting via the phone or the internet or apps for the phone, where the voice is used. It's not just text. People actually talk to one another, but they don't know who the other person is. There's known voice chatting via phone or internet or app, where people know who the other person is and they talk via their voice, not just via text, in a sexual way. Now, I've left out sending sexual images or videos to one another because it's not entirely clear that that is specifically a form of electronic sexual chatting rather than a form of pornography, even if it's one-to-one person pornography. Now, this shows that there are some conceptual unclarities at the boundaries of these categories. Maybe it's the case that some forms of chatting count as pornography while others don't. Some forms of pornography count as chatting while others don't. And those issues are more complicated than we'll be able to settle in this particular lecture. Now, a question, once we see these many different kinds of electronic sexual chatting. Do the intrinsic moral properties of any of these kinds of electronic sexual chatting differ from any of the others, and if so, why? So, for example, is anonymous internet chatting more sexual or more morally burdensome or weighty than known internet chatting, and if so, why, or vice versa? According to Portmann, all forms of electronic sexual chatting are morally equivalent to one another. At least he doesn't tell us that there are moral distinctions to be made, and we would think that he would tell us that there were moral distinctions to be made if some forms of electronic sexual chatting were morally better or morally worse than others. While Portmann's article addresses a number of interrelated, although conceptually distinct, issues and questions, Portmann's central guiding question is this: is there anything about electronic sexual chatting that makes electronic sexual chatting itself a type or a kind of sex? And further, while Portmann's article presents a number of interrelated, although again conceptually distinct, theses, things he's trying to prove, Portmann's central thesis is this: that electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex. As we've noted, Portmann's article contains a number of questions and theses that aren't central to what he's proving, but that follow from what he's proving, and he ends up giving answers, responses to these questions in the form of subsidiary theses. So, some questions that are related to Portmann's guiding question are these: is electronic sexual chatting morally equivalent to sex? If electronic sexual chatting is not morally equivalent to sex, then what is the moral status of electronic sexual chatting? How are the moral statuses of electronic sexual chatting and the use of pornography related to one another? And is electronic sexual chatting a form of infidelity, or can it be a form of infidelity? Portmann's responses to these subsidiary questions in the form of a few subsidiary theses are these: electronic sexual chatting is not morally equivalent to sex. Electronic sexual chatting is not morally ideal, but it's not therefore immoral, and electronic sexual chatting is less morally weighty than is sex. Electronic sexual chatting and the use of pornography, while not the same thing, are morally equivalent, and electronic sexual chatting is not a form of infidelity. As we've seen, Portmann's central thesis is that electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex. Portmann's central argument in favor of that thesis relies on identifying a necessary condition for something to be a type or kind of sex, and then to show that electronic sexual chatting fails to meet this necessary condition. A necessary condition is a condition that a particular thing has to meet in order to be what it is. Thus, if X is a necessary condition for A, then anything that is A meets condition X, and nothing that does not meet condition X is A. Here's Portmann's argument in premise-conclusion form. 1. If something, X, is a type of sex, then X involves physical contact between the participants. That is, physical contact is the necessary condition for sex. Something can't be sex unless there's physical contact. But electronic sexual chatting does not involve physical contact between the participants. Therefore, electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex. Now we should note here that very broadly there is a form of physical contact between the participants in electronic sexual chatting, but it's similar to the form of contact that I have with you right now. I am physically speaking into a microphone, and the computer that the microphone is attached to is going to encode my voice digitally, and then it will be transferred across the internet, and your computer and your internet connection and your speakers will turn all of that back into sound waves, and so there is a physical connection between you and me. It's not as though we are entirely on different physical planes or something like that. That's not the sort of physical connection, physical contact that Portmann is talking about here. He's talking about some form of direct face-to-face physical contact. And since electronic sexual chatting has none of that, Portmann says that electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex. An important distinction that goes on in Portmann's project, and in fact it's an important distinction for all of philosophy of sex, all of ethics, and all of philosophy broadly, is the distinction between intrinsic moral properties and extrinsic moral properties. If X has moral property M intrinsically, then X is morally M because of what X essentially is, and X is M no matter what. If, on the other hand, X has moral property M extrinsically, then X is morally M because of circumstances surrounding X, and X could be M in some circumstances and not M in others. So an example, baby torture is probably intrinsically morally wrong. That's because of the sort of action that baby torture is. Doesn't matter if you do it today, doesn't matter if you do it tomorrow, doesn't matter if you do it in a different country, doesn't matter if you surround it by balloons. Baby torture is morally wrong because of what baby torture is. On the other hand, feeding a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to a person is extrinsically morally wrong if that person's allergic to peanuts, but it's not extrinsically morally wrong in most other cases. If I give you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and you're not allergic to peanuts, I may have done something morally good. I may have made you happy. If, however, you are allergic to peanuts and I feed you this sandwich without telling you what I'm giving you, then I've done something morally wrong because of the circumstances that surround the feeding you the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. What Portmann is interested in here is whether there's anything intrinsic to electronic sexual chatting that would make electronic sexual chatting a form of sex. The main claim, and the one in need of most support in Portman's argument, is that physical contact between participants is required in order for something to count as sex. When you saw that, you might have said, is that really true? It's not clear. Now, Portmann doesn't anywhere offer us a direct defense of the claim that physical contact is necessary for sex. Instead, he offers a number of distinctions, explications, and analyses that all have the end result of moving us closer to an acceptance of the claim that physical contact is necessary for sex. We'll look at 4 of the main claims, distinctions, explications, analyses that Portmann gives us that are supposed to move us closer to an acceptance of the claim that physical contact is necessary for sex. We'll look at the appeal to virginity preservation, the distinctions and relations between flirting, seduction, and sex, the distinctions and relations between voyeurism, pornography, electronic sexual chatting, and sex, and the appeal to what Portmann calls penetration veneration. So here's a question for you. Is a person who has never had sex and who then engages in electronic sexual chatting still a virgin? Now, most of us would say yes, that engaging in electronic sexual chatting alone is not sufficient for a person to lose their virginity. But if this is true, and if it is necessary to have sex in order to lose one's virginity, then electronic sexual chatting isn't a form of sex. To put that argument into premise-conclusion form would look like this. If a person loses their virginity via some act, X, then X is a type of sex. A person who is a virgin before engaging in electronic sexual chatting is still a virgin directly after engaging in electronic sexual chatting. Therefore, electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex. So Portmann is primarily concerned with whether electronic sexual chatting is a type of sex, as we've seen. That is, Portmann is concerned with whether, when 2 or more people engage in electronic sexual chatting, they are actually having sex. If electronic sexual chatting is a type of sex, then electronic sexual chatting and sex are not metaphysically distinct from one another. If electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex, then electronic sexual chatting and sex are metaphysically distinct from one another. However, in addition to whether electronic sexual chatting and sex are the same thing, or whether electronic sexual chatting is a form of sex, we might also be concerned with whether electronic sexual chatting is morally equivalent to sex. That is, we might be concerned with whether the intrinsic properties of electronic sexual chatting and the intrinsic properties of sex are identical or equivalent. Electronic sexual chatting and sex might be just as morally good or just as morally bad as one another, without electronic sexual chatting being a type of sex. So as we look at Portmann's arguments here, remember that he is arguing in favor of the metaphysical distinctness of sex and electronic sexual chatting. Only after we look at these arguments will we look at a further question of the moral relatedness between electronic sexual chatting and sex. Portmann says that electronic sexual chatting is a type of flirting. Further, he says, flirting and seduction are not the same thing. While flirting and seduction might share a number of properties with one another, flirting can be an end in itself, while seduction always comes along with either an explicit or implicit expression of a desire and some minimal commitment, although certainly not a promise, to progress to sex. That is, two people could flirt with one another, and the point of it could be the flirting. But if one person is seducing somebody else, the point can't be seduction itself. The point is sex. That doesn't mean that all seduction progresses to sex, or that seduction isn't real seduction unless sex happens. It is to say that seduction has this either explicit or implicit expression of some sort of desire or plan to continue to sex. So were somebody attempting to seduce you and you allowed this seduction to take place, you allowed your seducer to seduce you, and then your seducer got up and left without having sex with you, you might rightly feel that you'd been misled. However, if you and somebody else were just flirting and your flirting partner then made it clear that no sex would follow from the flirtation, or your flirting partner got up and left, you might be disappointed. But you couldn't rightly feel that you had been misled, because flirting doesn't have to come along with an explicit or implicit expression of a desire and minimal further commitment to progress to sex. If this is all true, and if electronic sexual chatting is just a form of flirting, then we don't need to see electronic sexual chatting as a version of seduction, something that is hoping to lead toward sex. And certainly we don't need to see it as a version of sex. So, Portmann's saying, not only is electronic sexual chatting not sex, it's not even seduction. There's no claim that sex will happen in electronic sexual chatting, even if the content of that chatting is very sexual. A helpful way of thinking about the metaphysical status of electronic sexual chatting, says Portmann, is in terms of the relation between voyeurism, pornography, sex, and electronic sexual chatting's place in this relation. Voyeurism, watching other people have sex whether they know that you're doing it or not, might be sexual, and it might lead to sexual pleasure on the part of the voyeur. But voyeurism is not itself sex. A voyeur hasn't himself or herself engaged in sex via voyeurism. Now, the consumption of pornography, naked images of people or of people having sex, again might be sexual, and it might lead to sexual pleasure on the part of the consumer. But pornography, or the consumption of pornography itself, isn't sex. A consumer of pornography hasn't himself or herself engaged in sex via the consumption of pornography. Electronic sexual chatting isn't exactly like voyeurism, and it isn't exactly like pornography, but it's similar to both of them, says Portmann. Electronic sexual chatting is similar to voyeurism in that another person is present, And it's similar to pornography in that the other person consents. Oftentimes, in voyeurism, the other person doesn't consent to being watched. Thus, says Portmann, electronic sexual chatting, while itself not pornography, is morally equivalent to the consumption of pornography. Thus, what we think about the consumption of pornography in terms of its moral status and in terms of its not being sex, even though it is sexual, we should think about electronic sexual chatting. And finally, there's the appeal to penetration veneration, as Portmann calls it. To almost everyone, penile-vaginal penetration is a form of sex. That is, penile-vaginal penetration is sufficient for sex, according to almost everybody. Many people also seem to think that penile-vaginal penetration is not only sufficient for sex, but also necessary for sex, such that sex has occurred if, and only if, penile-vaginal penetration has occurred. Thus, we see people claiming never to have had sex if they haven't engaged in penile-vaginal penetration. Now, clearly, if penile-vaginal penetration is both necessary and sufficient for sex, then electronic sexual chatting is not a type of sex because no penetration is occurring in electronic sexual chatting. However, we might worry that this picture of sex is arbitrarily narrow, that the definition excludes too much and it excludes it for no good reason. According to this picture, there's no such thing as homosexual sex. It's conceptually impossible to have homosexual sex, since in homosexual sex there's no penile-vaginal penetration, and according to this picture, penile-vaginal penetration is necessary for sex. So at this point, we might broaden the definition to include penile-anal penetration, but then the distinction between anal penetration and oral penetration looks somewhat arbitrary, so we might want to include oral penetration in what counts as sex, but now we're off on a slippery slope where either it looks like everything counts as sex or nothing at all counts as sex, and so we might worry that what's gotten us onto this slippery slope is penetration veneration, is being so concerned with penetration when we talk about sex. Maybe some penetration is sex and some penetration is not sex, and it's more complicated than just all penile-vaginal penetration is sex and nothing else is. So let's say that we're convinced that Portmann has convinced us that electronic sexual chatting is not a form of sex. What has this given us philosophically? Well, on the one hand, it's given us quite a lot, but on the other hand, it actually hasn't given us all that much. If electronic sexual chatting is not sex, then that means that there is no intrinsic metaphysical connection between the properties, moral or otherwise, of sex and the properties, moral or otherwise, of electronic sexual chatting. That shows us that electronic sexual chatting is not metaphysically the same thing as having sex. So we've learned something about the deep structure of the relationship between electronic sexual chatting and sex. However, this doesn't show us that electronic sexual chatting isn't morally wrong, or morally bad, or morally non-ideal, and it doesn't show us that electronic sexual chatting isn't very bad for a relationship, or maybe even a form of infidelity, if things other than sex itself can be forms of infidelity. Thus, these questions still need to be addressed, even if electronic sexual chatting is not itself metaphysically the same thing as sex. Many people who talk about the moral status of electronic sexual chatting appeal to statistics or anecdotal arguments, figures about how electronic sexual chatting and relationships or sexual health are related to one another. Oftentimes, these arguments come in the form of pointing out the consequences, actual, probable, or likely consequences for people who engage in electronic sexual chatting. A consequentialistic argument is one that claims that the properties of the consequences of some action are relevant to the properties of the action itself. The most common consequentialistic arguments are moral in nature, and they claim that actions are morally better when they produce better consequences, and that actions are morally worse when they produce worse consequences. It's tempting when evaluating the morality or moral properties of electronic sexual chatting to look at the consequences of electronic sexual chatting. However, we need to be very careful here to distinguish between the actual consequences of particular instances of electronic sexual chatting on the one hand, and the possible or even likely consequences of electronic sexual chatting on the other. So if, for example, it's possible that a person will leave their spouse because of engaging in electronic sexual chatting, that doesn't on its own make electronic sexual chatting morally bad. Even if it's likely that a person will leave their spouse because of engaging in electronic sexual chatting, if that person doesn't actually do that, then in what sense could we be concerned that electronic sexual chatting is morally bad because of the consequences? If the probable consequences are bad, but the actual consequences aren't, then someone could say, look, I recognize that for other people, electronic sexual chatting has these negative consequences, but it didn't have these consequences for me. How can we say that other people's actions and the consequences of other people's actions are somehow relevant to the moral status of my actions? So Portmann has argued that electronic sexual chatting and sex are not metaphysically the same thing. We've started to look at ways to investigate the moral properties of electronic sexual chatting. Here's what Portmann says about the moral properties of electronic sexual chatting. He says, while perhaps not the moral ideal, chat room adventures should not be considered adultery or infidelity. The possibility of deceit lurks here, as it does in so many other places. We may pretend to our spouse or spouse equivalents that we could not even look at another man or woman. There is no question that Romeos and Juliets would be guilty of deceiving their partners if they entered a chat room after having declared that they couldn't conceive of doing so. How many among us pretend never to notice attractive strangers? How many of us feel threatened when our partners do notice attractive strangers, or familiars for that matter? Chiding chatters may reveal more personal insecurity than moral concern. In any event, it seems the only durable moral objection to chatting is deceit. There might be a good practical objection as well, that chatting will inure us to erotic pleasure with our spouses. If the mind could be so easily dulled by the computer screen, then chatting might, in fact, threaten a sexual tie to a spouse or spouse equivalent. The thought here is that electronic sexual chatting isn't intrinsically morally wrong or morally bad, nor does it intrinsically fall far from the moral ideal. Instead, if we're using electronic sexual chatting in a way that we're deceiving our spouses or partners or spouse equivalents, then it's the deceit that's wrong or bad, but not the electronic sexual chatting. In fact, Portmann thinks that there is a positive picture of electronic sexual chatting that we can give. It's not just that electronic sexual chatting isn't morally awful. There might be some positive moral things to say in its defense. He says, "Is cyber chatting the moral equivalent of talking to someone in a bar then? Anonymous chatting is morally superior to the extent that it is less likely to lead to physical contact. Is net naughtiness, even when it becomes a habit, morally worse than an actual and physical one-night stand? No. Net naughtiness enhances the sexual imagination. It teaches as it titillates. Giving in to lust and allowing ourselves to chat may provide the illusion of flying over personal limitations that reduce our attractiveness to others. So much of human industry, for example, cosmetics, fitness, fashion, and real estate, comes down to this goal that we really should look sympathetically on chatting. Moreover, we may deepen our sense of who we are and what we want from anonymous chatting. Net naughtiness challenges the sexual uniformity many take monogamy to impose. It shows us something like sexual diversity is possible without shattering monogamous bonds. So there might be many good consequences from electronic sexual chatting. There might be a limitation of the bad consequences that we otherwise think exist. Even further, if we want to be consistent, then we should treat electronic sexual chatting, says Portmann, in the same way as we treat use of cosmetics or working out or looking fashionable or buying a big home. Those are ways for people to appear attractive or at least not to appear unattractive to others. So is electronic sexual chatting. Well, what about infidelity? The title of the article is that chatting is not cheating. So what about the cheating is important here? Portmann never clearly defines infidelity for us. However, we can extrapolate a definition, at least for monogamous relationships, that looks something like this. A person has engaged in infidelity if, and only if, they have sex with someone who is not their partner. Thus, sex with someone who is not a person's partner is both necessary and sufficient for infidelity, according to the picture that seems to be presented by Portmann. However, this condition of sex with someone who's not a person's partner seems at once too broad and too narrow. So, for example, what if a couple has a threesome with another person? There would be sex with somebody who's not a person's partner, but that doesn't seem like infidelity. What if one partner says that it's okay, but just once, for the other to have sex with somebody else? That's sex. That's not with somebody's partner, but that doesn't seem like infidelity. What if one partner kisses someone else, or is naked with someone else, or has oral sex with somebody else? Those all seem like they might be versions of infidelity, but none of those are sex, at least not on the penetration model of sex that Portmann has given us. Even though many people would consider sex with a non-partner to be infidelity, we might wonder whether sex itself is intrinsically a form of infidelity at all, or instead, whether many people simply agree to extrinsically consider sex of a certain sort to be infidelity. If sex with a non-partner is both necessary and sufficient for infidelity, as Portmann seems to think, then electronic sexual chatting can't possibly be a form of infidelity, no matter what anyone thinks or agrees not to do. However, if sex with a non-partner is not necessary for infidelity, then things other than sex might count as infidelity. So imagine two couples, call them couple A and couple B. These couples are exactly alike in terms of their sex lives and monogamous agreements with one another, except for the fact that both members of couple A have agreed that electronic sexual chatting outside of their relationship is permitted or maybe even encouraged, but both members of couple B have agreed that electronic sexual chatting outside of the relationship is not permitted. Doesn't it seem as though a member of couple B would have committed infidelity, actual and serious, real infidelity, by engaging in electronic sexual chatting outside of the relationship, while infidelity via electronic sexual chatting isn't possible for either member of couple A? If this seems right to you, then even though electronic sexual chatting might not be sex, as Portmann has argued, it might still be, in certain circumstances, a form of infidelity. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't at least gesture at the gendered nature of the power relations at work in the possibility of electronic sexual chatting, as well as the reactions we have to people engaging in electronic sexual chatting outside of their relationships. This will need to be just a gesture because discussing gendered power relations and their place in certain societies and their historical conditions is much more than we could possibly hope to address in a single lecture. Women's sexuality has traditionally been monitored, controlled, suppressed, outright denied, or even destroyed. With the advent of electronic communications technology, women have the ability to subvert a system that systematically disadvantages and subjugates them in terms of sexuality. So electronic sexual chatting provides the possibility of more benefit to women than it does to men, since women have more to gain from subverting immoral sexual domination. Even further, it's been claimed, although I should note many of these claims seem dubious at best, that in general, women are more sexually interested in narrative and description than they are in pure visual stimulation. Now, if that's true, then electronic sexual chatting is a form of sexual behavior that is more sexually beneficial to women than it is to men in terms of expressing and maintaining sexual power. In this lecture, we've looked at 7 topics. 1. Why care about electronic sexual chatting? 2. Portmann's guiding question, central thesis, and subsidiary questions and theses. 3. Intrinsic versus extrinsic moral properties. 4. Portmann's central argument. 5. The moral properties of electronic sexual chatting. 6. The relation between electronic sexual chatting and infidelity. And 7. Electronic sexual chatting and power relations. Thank you.